Good evening, everyone. This is Jeffrey Tucker with Liberty.me, the Chief Liberty Officer. And tonight I'm broadcasting here actually from Grand Rapids, Michigan at the Acton University, here representing Liberty.me and the Foundation for Economic Education. And tonight we're talking with Onar Am and Doug Casey about the Free State Initiative Africa. And there's been a lot of buildup and mystery about exactly what these two men have been up to. And I think we're going to hear something about it tonight. So, shall we begin, gentlemen?
Sure.
All right, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start, but do you have any introducing question or something that you want to start me off with, or do you just want?
Yes. Well, how about what were you doing in Africa, and what is the meaning of all this?
All right. So I can take the background here. That a couple of years ago, I met an interesting guy in Norway, of all places. He's partially African, partially French, and I talked about my idea of creating a free state, and he was very interested. And he told me, "Well, I have connections in my country." So I sort of said, "Okay, that's nice." I didn't take it too seriously because I was used to people saying that sort of saying things all the time. But he returned and he says, "Come quick! You have to come to Paris to see the ambassador." So I went down there, and we were preparing to see the president. And ever since then, we've been working with setting up a meeting. So in 2012, I went there. I talked to all sorts of ministers and directors in various departments. So he did actually have all the connections he said he would. And what basically we got as a message is, this is a great idea, we love it, but you're not heavy enough. You're just you. So we need you to come back with some greater arms, so to speak, more heavy power. So bring along a big investor, and we'll talk about it. So I was thinking, okay, I need to have someone who is sufficiently known along with me, but at the same time who's receptive enough for these kinds of ideas. And that sort of narrowed down the field quite a lot. And so by coincidence, I came across some writing of Doug, where he says that he's had as a hobby to travel around Africa. Not just Africa, but all over the world, but to be able to basically do what I've been doing, but on a little bit larger scale. I'm sure Doug can talk a little bit more about his endeavors to do that. But basically, we had a conversation. I presented my version of the plan, and it is pretty close to his. He wanted to put a whole country on a stock exchange, basically privatize an entire country, whereas my plan is much less ambitious than that, basically just taking a tiny proportion of a country and turning into a free state, which is not the same as a sovereign nation. It's still under the jurisdiction of the national entity, so it'll be a state like Texas is a state in the United States, so to speak. And the basic thing is that the Congress will create special laws for this region, stating, in this region we have legal stability, these are the rules, and they will not change. And those rules will be very liberty-oriented. The goal is to have zero tax and zero regulations and great personal freedom. Of course, you can own property and all of these things. So the goal, of course, is to zero tax, because if you have 1%, even just 0.1% tax, then you have to have all the bureaucracy of accounting, and people have to tell how much they earn and all of that. So the difference between 0 and 0.1% is huge. So the goal is 0%. So you actually don't have to register a company in order to do business. So locally. However, whenever you cross the border into in the international zone, there has to be international compliance, because if we try to not do that, we're going to get so much trouble with the OECD, like tax havens, blah blah blah, all of this. So there has to be international compliance. So whenever you cross the border with your money from within the Free State, there is all of these rules that you have to comply with in the rest of the world. Now, that's not the Free State's fault, that's the rest of the world's fault. But it's no more different to crossing that border than any other border. But as long as you're inside the border, the goal is that within there is a safe haven. You don't have to register your company. You don't have to pay tax. You can do banking locally if you want. You don't need a license for that, and you don't need a license for running a taxi or a bus, or you don't need licensing for building buildings. You can do that on your own property. So within the zone, or within the Free State, you have great liberty. That's the basic idea of it. And they loved it. And we went there now in a couple of months ago, or 1 month ago, with me and Doug here. So we were able to have lots of meetings, but unfortunately, we were not able to meet the president of this country at this time. And the reason for that is partially our own choice. We were planning to visit 2 countries, to talk to 2 governments on this trip, but we ended up only going for 1 because of time constraints. But we made some really great contacts with high level people, like rich people within the country who are well connected in politics, and they basically advised us to go a little bit slower, because if we meet the president and we push too hard on an issue and he says no for whatever reason, he can never go back. That's just the way politics works. He can't change his mind. So, and what we're working on now is to get this politically correct way of stating things. So all we're asking for at the moment is to have a letter of intent, or like an almost like an expression of interest. It's a non-committing, politically non-committing paper, basically saying that they're interested in looking into the possibility of creating a free state, and they like this idea. So they're not committing to anything, but the very process of making that public statement is good enough for us to go to investors and other interested parties in America and other places to say, look, we have a public statement from a government that say they are interested in doing this. Now, are you interested in starting a negotiation here and starting to get real, looking into this, making it a real project? And we have good connections with several potentially big investors and big partners, and we are quite certain that if they get involved, there's a very high probability that they will get involved if we get the ball rolling. But if they get involved, there's a very high likelihood that it's going to end up with a free state. So if they get involved, I personally think it's around 50% probability that there will be a free state in that
I
region.
love this pressure. What is the model that based on? I know there are a number of these sorts of regions in Argentina and Chile, even Nicaragua, mostly Latin America, the ones I know of, not Africa.
Well, this is not a free zone. The difference between a free zone and a free state, it partially is a public relations thing, marketing, showing that this is something more and stronger than a zone. In a zone, you still have the official national courts. You still have the official national police to enforce laws within that boundary, within that zone. So you don't actually have the advantage of a first world court system in such a zone. Now there are countries and places that have employed first world courts, like you have Mauritius in close to Madagascar. They are using the British court system to ensure property rights at the moment. So because of that, they are now actually on the top 10 lists of economically free countries in the world, above the United States, which is amazing. Another that has done something similar is United Arab Emirates, that has created a financial zone where they say it's based on basically British law and British courts. So they're ensuring that contracts made in this zone will be enforced not by the local courts, but by a respected court that everyone agrees. And this is our plan too, except that we also, in addition, want to sort of seal off this area so that there's no, you can seal it off from the rest of the country, so that there's a little bit of immigration control. In addition, you have local police in this area that is recruited not from the country itself, or it can be, but they're recruited based on entirely on competence, entirely on that the fact that they're skilled and not corrupt, and we want to recruit them from all over the world, and so this will ensure that you have good local law enforcement that is based on skill. Basically, they have to win in the marketplace, and also the same with the courts, that the people who are allowed to work in the courts have to be the best from across the world. We are not a nation. It's only based on competence and skill. So that's the basic model, that it's free zone plus local enforcement based on recruition from all over the world.
So there's already a question in chat. Why would the surrounding governments support this? Why would they stand to gain?
Well, this is the surrounding. This is still within. This is not a new country. It is a region within an existing country, a host nation, and the host nation doesn't want to do this unless there's a lot of money in it for them, or development for the country. So basically what we are arguing is that the focus of the Free State will be economic development, meaning unless there's something really, really big in it for the host country, they're not going to say yes to it. So the main focus is attracting investors in here. So we have several arguments that I really, really like. They're saying, we're saying the proximity effect. They can get the best investors in the world just next door. And today they are just not available. And this country has some natural resources. Those natural resources are today discounted in value because of corruption, insecurity, and just bad location. And facilities, lack of good internet, lack of good living conditions, hotels, resorts, all of these issues. So it's very difficult to get companies today into this country, this particular country, to invest there because they just don't like the lack of property rights. They don't like the laws. They don't like the corruption. They don't like, well, basically they don't like mostly anything. So by having a safe haven within the country where they can place the headquarters, it's much easier to attract companies from all over the world to operate within the country itself. So our goal is that the Free State will not include any natural resources. No natural resources will be included in the Free State at all, except for access to the water, like seawater. Fresh water is not included, so we have to desalinate seawater in order to get it. So we don't want anyone to be. The reason we do this is because we don't want radical left-wingers to be able to say that, oh, we stole natural resources and that's why it succeeded. In fact, we want to say, no, it didn't have any resources at all, and it still succeeded. And we also don't want the left-wingers to be able to say, oh, we stole this country from the natives who were already living there. So we are choosing an area where there are no people. There's just basically empty land. So it will be a pristine environment. And our goal is to make it relatively big. The size we're talking about now is 1,000 square kilometers. And that's actually fairly large. I also think that
that's gigantic, actually. Yeah, that's big. That's a big piece of property.
That also distinguishes it from most other projects. Most other projects are like 5 square kilometers or something like that. Whereas this is a very, very large thing. And it can easily be expanded because, I mean, African countries are really large. So we're going to sort of try to say to them that, okay, if you've accepted 1,000 square kilometers, how about extending it to, say, 2,500 square kilometers? And thereby it's bigger than Luxembourg. I mean, they don't lose a lot of land from that. It's a very big country. But the public relations effect of having a free state of that size, of that magnitude, is quite nice. Plus, it means also that you can have huge projects in there. I mean, not just for living, but I mean, if you want to have whatever kind of industrial activity or leisure activity within there, there's a lot of space for that.
It's really a remarkable kind of trend. I mean, that we're seeing this kind of pressure around the world. I see it as a sign of a certain decline and fall of the nation state, actually. That it's just a matter of time, where gradually the world is re-privatized, a bit at a time. And that's why I think these things are so significant. I know even in Atlanta, where I live, the city government is selling off large parts of land to private investors to start private public access communities.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and it's taking place. So what's significant about this, it seems to me, is it's taking place in light of two critical factors. One is that governments are out of money. The second thing is that they're out of ideas. So if you're out of money and ideas, why not just let people move in and do their own thing? And that's a story of the bankruptcy of states, essentially.
One of the reasons focusing on a backward poor country in Africa is because, well, my experience is that they are just much more receptive to ideas of liberty, of change. I mean, as you say, they're out of ideas and they're poor. And what do they have to lose? Very little. What do they have to gain? a lot. So they are not fat and happy. If we try to do this in Australia or a European country, it's much more difficult because they are already rich. Why would they want to do this? But with a poor country, it's a much higher chance of success, and that is also why the focus has been on really, really poor countries. And we don't have only one candidate. There's actually 4 or 5 really good candidates in Africa at this time, maybe more. But we're sort of starting with one country now and taking it from there after a while.
You know, the prospects are quite extraordinary and completely unanticipated, of course. I mean, that's what's exciting and remarkable about it. But in the end, privately owned communities with zero taxes and, you know, no regulations are going to be more successful, you know, in just purely material terms, right, than any other model.
Now, actually, that is one of the big things about this. I'm not trying to appeal to the liberty community, like as so many projects have done. And Doug agrees with me on this. I'm sure he can talk about it also. That libertarians are fat and happy too. It's just a sad fact. They're not going to move across the world, and most projects like the Gulf Gulch and all of these things, they have failed to attract interest to a very large extent because people are not interested in just going away from their current lives. So the Free State turns this around on its head. We're not thinking about the liberty community at all. If it's based on the people from the liberty community making this a success, it would be an utter failure because
right.
it's always been that in the past. So the 95% of the people who will be living in a free state like this is going to be poor people from poor countries in search of job opportunities. Now, they're not going to bring money into it, but they're going to bring their workforce. And this combines well with investors who are looking for cheap labor. So we're trying to create all the advantages of a poor nation, in other words, cheap labor, in combination with all the advantages of a really, really well-developed nation like Hong Kong or Singapore, which means very low corruption and good rule of law and good security of property rights. So if you have that combination in place, you have business dynamite. So it's just going to be very successful only based on that, is our belief at the moment. Mm-hmm. And even if we don't succeed with number one, the first free state, to get all we want, if this is just going to be even if it just matches Singapore or Hong Kong in terms of freedom, that's still a major leap, because we've actually just created a model for duplication. This is a little bit like Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. He says the big step in innovation is not going from 1 to 100, it's going from 0 to 1. The first one is always the most difficult one. So if we can succeed in proving that one free state is a viable model, there's going to be 2 free states, and then there's going to be 5, and then 50. Exactly. And once you have 50 free states, one of them is they're going to be competing with each other on the market of good laws. Who can provide the best laws to its potential investors and citizens? And in that race, the leftists will call this the race to the bottom, but for us, it's the race to the top. Who can race towards liberty the fastest? Just getting that positive spin and cycle started is going to move the world in the correct direction. Peter Thiel also says something that's really interesting, that how many nations will there be in 50 years? is it a good thing if there's more nations or less nations? And he concludes that, yes, it's better to have more nations because you have competition between nations. Now, these free states will not be nations, but they will be jurisdictional entities that operates like almost like nations. So they will add to the competition between nations, and they will force the other nations to compete.
Well, Doug has been on the forefront of this kind of effort at applied liberty, and I've appreciated his thinking on this. Is there any chance we can get Doug involved here at all? Can we?
Well, sure, Jeff. But generally speaking, I would rather listen than talk, because you can't learn anything by talking. And Onar has done an excellent job of explaining exactly what we're doing there. And as you mentioned earlier, this has been a hobby of mine for the last 30 years, and I've pitched a variety of this plan to, so far, 10 nation states. In almost all those cases, the president or preferably the military dictator that ran the place. I've had wonderfully exciting adventures doing this, but no success so far. Perhaps because the variety that I've been putting forth before them was too steep a gradient, was too radical. And I think that the idea of the free state might be more palatable for them. They feel like they have less to lose and more to gain. And so it's, I'm not sure if there's anything I can really add to that. Unless there's something specific you're thinking of, Jeff.
Well, what about your point that you prefer dealing with military dictators to democratically elected presidents? Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure, because they make all the decisions. If you can convince him, you're over the hump. It's a lot easier than convincing several 100,000 people. And generally speaking, that's the ideal size country, is tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. It's very hard to make the sale to the mob. And generally, my pitch to these guys has been, look, I think I can do three things for you. It always gets their attention. They'll always listen to this. Number one, I can make you legitimately very wealthy, because they all understand that stealing money in the manner of Mobutu and Marcos and Mugabe doesn't go down as smooth as it has in decades past. So this gets their attention. Number two, putting a plan like this into effect would make them beloved by the people, viewed as the George Washington, if you would, of their country. And this is a lot better than worrying about getting a bullet to the back of the head at any time. And number three, it would make them a world figure. And they'd be on the front page of every magazine in the world in a favorable light for the next decade. And the world doesn't know that these guys, most of these dictators exist even. And if they do know they exist, it's in a very unfavorable light. So I've always had good luck getting a hearing, and that's where the fun starts. But that's what I've been doing in the past. But I think that Onar's variation on this theme is excellent. I've always liked the idea of taking all of the government assets in a country public on a major world stock exchange and making sure that each man, woman, and child of the country owns shares in it, so they have an interest, vested interest in the success of the project. That is power to the people, a phrase that appeals to ideological communists, at least in theory. So I guess that's what I'd add.
That sounds like a brilliant practical suggestion for freedom. Well, these kinds of things excite me so much because they're, yeah, it's a little eccentric. Maybe it's implausible. Maybe everything doesn't work out exactly the way you want. But it's fun to kind of push out at the margins and help people imagine possibilities, and I think it actually does have a very practical effect on the world, and I think we're starting to see that actually. As I mentioned, Doug, we're starting to see this truly in.
Mr. Tucker?
Fine. Good evening. Pardon me, just one second. Could you fix my thing? I'm so sorry.
AC.
That's right.
Oh, it feels nice in here though. Sounds like it's working.
Yeah. Well, in any case, so it's like a practical measure that I'm seeing implemented in cities around the United States. I mean, we're starting to see this occur in places in the Northeast and the South where government plans are just drying up. They're just not working like they once did. But it makes me feel very much like we're kind of coming to the end of an age of central planning.
That sounds like a good
Well,
analysis.
you might think that, but I'm not so sure that that's the case, because at the moment, at least within the United States and most advanced Western countries, the direction is actually the opposite, where the state's becoming more powerful, not less powerful. I think it'll turn around. I agree with you for the long run. But for the moment,
what I mean, Doug, is, for example, Doug, if I could just kind of fill that out in a second, you remember how in the 1950s and the 1960s, it seemed like every few years there was a gigantic new plan for urban planning, and urban renewal, and some huge public housing units go up, and an excited sort of campaign for some great way to revive the city again, or whatever. And through the federal government too, right? I mean, we went through a whole succession of absurd plans for making the nation mighty and wonderful, from the New Deal to World War II to the Great Society and blah, 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 on and on. But I guess my point is you don't really hear much about this kind of stuff anymore. I mean, there's a certain bankruptcy of ideas in the policy realm.
that's a very good point. And this is one of the reasons why I'm pleased the looming bankruptcy of the U.S. government. They're going to be less able to do all these stupid things.
Yeah.
Am I hearing myself on a 2-second time delay also?
No, you sound actually excellent to me. Actually, I mean, I'm pleased at this sort of this hack that we did with Skype. It's actually working very well, Doug. I mean, I feel like you're here, so this is really fantastic. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the reason why I'm pessimistic about the U.S. and other big Western democracies is that the state, I agree, is at its death throes. It's like a giant dinosaur thrashing around. It's very dangerous at its death throes, where the police are becoming more powerful, and their laws about where you can open a bank account and so forth are becoming much more draconian.
Yeah.
So things will get better, but
it looks to me the existing structure of statism is getting more intense, but we're not seeing big new implementations of structures we haven't seen before. I guess that's my main point, which I think is probably on the balance, sort of a sign of hope. I guess that's all.
Let me just add in here that there's actually a big echo. Now I can actually hear the echo on my line as well. So an echo both from me and Doug. So I think there might be an issue in your end.
You know what? I can't hear it. I can't hear it. It's so bad.
Right now, you can hear an echo.
Yes. Not from you.
Yes. Not when you talk, but when I talk, or when Onar talks.
It sounds perfect to me. What are people in the chat saying? Let me just check real quick before we just cut this thing out.
They say there's an echo.
Oh, it's only with Doug. Well, yeah.
And with me.
Isn't it?
And with me.
That's so interesting. Well, in any case, I have headphones on. Everything seems good. So, well, nonetheless, probably we've covered the topic that we want to talk about, and it's not a bad thing to end it. So, I mean, I could hang out with both of you all evening if the technology were right. I'm just glad this thing worked at all. I mean, it's kind of remarkable. So I'm so happy to have had you both with me. I hope to see you both at some events in the future, Freedom Fest, whatever it's going to be. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Doug.
I'll look forward to catching up with you at Freedom Fest. Yeah.
Okay. All the best to you both. Take care.
Thank you.
Night night. To a free world.
Thanks,
all the best.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
I can start, but do you have any introducing question or something that you want to start me off with, or do you just want?
Yes. Well, how about what were you doing in Africa, and what is the meaning of all this?
All right. So I can take the background here. That a couple of years ago, I met an interesting guy in Norway, of all places. He's partially African, partially French, and I talked about my idea of creating a free state, and he was very interested. And he told me, "Well, I have connections in my country," so I sort of said, "Okay, that's nice." I didn't take it too seriously because I was used to people doing, but on a little bit larger scale. I'm sure Doug can talk a little bit more about his endeavors to do that. But basically, we had a conversation. I presented my version of the plan, and it is pretty close to his. He wanted to put a whole country on a stock exchange, basically privatize an entire country, whereas my plan is much less ambitious than that, basically just taking a tiny proportion of a country and turning into a free state, which is not the same as a sovereign nation. It's still under the jurisdiction of the national entity. So it'll be a state like, so we need you to come back with some greater arms, so to speak, more heavy power. So bring along a big investor and we'll talk about it. So I was thinking, okay, I need to have someone who is sufficiently known along with me, but at the same time who's receptive enough for these kinds of ideas. And that sort of narrowed down the field quite a lot. And so by coincidence, I came across some writing of Doug, where he says that he's had as a hobby to travel around Africa, not just Africa, but all over the world, but to be able to basically do what I've been doing, saying things all the time. But he returned and he says, come quick, you have to come to Paris to see the ambassador. So I went down there and we were preparing to see the president. And ever since then, we've been working with setting up a meeting. So in 2012, I went there. I talked to all sorts of ministers and directors in various departments. So he did actually have all the connections he said he would. And what basically we got as a message is, this is a great idea, we love it, but you're not heavy enough. You're just you.
Good evening, everyone. This is Jeffrey Tucker with Liberty.me, the Chief Liberty Officer. And tonight I'm broadcasting here actually from Grand Rapids, Michigan at the Acton University, here representing Liberty.me and the Foundation for Economic Education. And tonight we're talking with Onar Am and Doug Casey about the Free State Initiative Africa. And there's been a lot of buildup and mystery about exactly what these two men have been up to. And I think we're going to hear something about it tonight. So, shall we begin? Gentlemen.
Sure.
All right, do you want to start?
Yeah, we